what I'm going to speak about, I'm basically going to speak about some of the work which I've been doing. So I just try to come up with a theme which just speaks about the understanding of ecosystem processes in order to deal with climate change. I'm not really going to touch on the adaptation and the mitigation, but I'm just going to show the first step which we're going to, in order to deal with climate change anyway, is to actually understand the processes that drive the climate change and what is actually happening. So climate change is a very broad topic. There's so many things that we could look at when it comes to climate change. But like what I'm going to do here is just give like a brief introduction into climate change, and then just speak about some of the work which I've done in my very, very short academic journey. So I'll speak about some of the work which I did during my master's and some of the work that I'm currently doing right now as well. So what I'm basically going to try and look at is try to look at different scales, linking from the field, what you can do in the field, all right up to, so say, continental scale, and using some of the other tools like remote sensing, which has been spoken about in the previous presentation. So this picture over here just shows some of the landscapes that we have in Africa, and the map on the right as well just speaks about the different kinds of vegetation that we find here in Africa. This is going to be very important as I go through this presentation. So you just have to take a look at that picture and just keep it at the back of your mind. When you look at this image here, what do you think about? So when you think about climate change, basically you always think about something dry, something dead, basically the little bit of vegetation as seen in this image. But there's a whole lot more to do with that. So the global climate is changing, and to be able to detect climate change, we really need to look at the things that influence climate change. So we've seen headlines like these in previous years, that Madagascar is on the brink of climate change-induced famine. And we've also seen examples of what climate change can do. I just didn't put it here on this particular slide, but we saw the floods that we had in KZN in the past few months, and can see the kind of devastation that climate change can actually bring. So these are some of the biggest challenges that we're facing in Africa. And actually, we need more time to be able to discuss this more in depth, but this just highlights the importance of actually understanding climate change, because it has an influence on our livelihoods, our day-to-day. Like you can see there, we're speaking about famine, speaking about infrastructure being destroyed. We're speaking about people starving, speaking about migration crisis as well. So there's so many things that climate change actually affects, instead of just the usual that it's getting hotter, it's getting drier, but there's so many other things that are important for climate change. And then there's also one thing which I would like to highlight there at the corner, the headline that speaks about the trouble with trees, the afforestation plans for Africa. That one of the other solutions that has often been given to deal with climate change is to plant trees. And sometimes tree planting is not necessarily the best way to do it, especially in Africa. You have to plant trees where trees are supposed to be, not just plant trees anyway. So this ties in nicely with some of the work which I'm going to be speaking about in this particular presentation. So the first thing that I will speak about is just some of my master's work, which was focusing on the phenology of high altitude and low latitude grasslands. So phenology is the study of the timing of biological events in plants and animals. And in this particular case, we're looking at the growing season. Grasslands are very important in the global carbon cycle, and grasslands do not have biomass, but they have soil carbon stores. So most of the time when we're thinking about carbon, we often look at forests because they have biomass and the ones that grow to pick up carbon from the atmosphere. But grasslands are also as important in that, and they take up more carbon, arguably, than trees, as they store all the carbon in the soil. And storing carbon in the soil is much better than storing in trees, because trees can be cut down, trees can be burnt, and all of that carbon that they store could be released back into the atmosphere. So the reason why we did this work here, most of this work has been done in the Northern Hemisphere, but these models which are, or the work that has been done is not necessarily applicable here in the Southern Hemisphere. So the only place where we find these kinds of grasslands is in the eastern part of South Africa. So they, in that map, highlighted in blue, those are the Afro-montane grasslands. which are different from the typical grasslands that we find, because they are just next to the mountain ranges. So all the previous work has been done on high latitude grasses has been done in the Northern Hemisphere, but this is one of the only places in Africa where you get montane grasslands. And then this study area is also part of the Witwatersrand montane grassland. So it's in the eastern part of South Africa, where we also find a lot of our power stations, and as well as the headwaters for the Vaal River, which provides water for most of Gauteng as well. So the vegetation that we find in this particular area is mostly montane grasslands, and then you do find some trees on top of the studies. This area is also highly transformed by agriculture and mining and human settlement. So the aim basically here, like I said, was to develop a model for these particular grasslands in Africa. So in order to do that, we need climate data. So what we did was to construct a 110-year record that was previously not available. So we did this from 1904 to 2017 at the time. And what we found is that we found a weak decreasing trend in rainfall. As you can see from this graph over there, that the rainfall is highly variable from year to year, but the general trend is that it is decreasing. And if you look at that equation over there, the average rainfall has decreased by about 71 millimeters over the past 100 years, which is quite a lot, which is about 10% of the rainfall anyway, because the average is about 700 millimeters for this particular place. So you can see that rainfall has decreased quite significantly. And then also we found that the temperature over that same time period has increased, with the maximum temperature increasing, the minimum temperature increasing at a much higher rate than the maximum temperature, which is usually an indication of climate change, as shown here in these graphs over there, where we can see the decreases, the increases in the temperature, both maximum, minimum, and the average temperature during that time period. So then after looking at these results, we wanted to see what exactly does it mean for the growing season. We'll focus mainly on the growing season, but then you can also answer many different questions using this kind of data in terms of how the temperature and rainfall actually affects different factors. So when we looked at the growing season, we actually found that the length of the growing season has increased. So the growing season basically is theoretically the time in which plants can grow. So when the conditions are good for growth. And we found that there is an increase in the growing season, which is not always expected, because we think that with higher temperatures and less rainfall, that the growing season would decrease. So then some of the reasons that we actually found is that this could also be due to an increase in the amount of carbon dioxide that has been emitted in the atmosphere. We never got a chance to test that in this particular study, but that is something that we can also look at. So just the point I'd like to emphasize at this point is that there's so many things that are linked together. It's very difficult to be able to get one particular explanation for some of the results that you see. So this is why it is also important to go out and look at each and every single process that has influence on climate change, for example, so that you can understand it. Much temperature and rainfall would be able to explain that there are also many other factors that could also have an influence on the length of the growing season. So the length of the growing season has increased, which is also consistent with other studies that have been done around the world, which shows that the growing season is lengthened because it starts much earlier than it used to, and it ends much later, which also could be linked to the temperature and rainfall, as well as carbon, as I have been speaking about. Another study that I've also been involved in was the one where we're looking at how drought affects shrub dieback in the Karoo. So as you can see, the Karoo vegetation is as shown here in the picture, and these are the people that I worked with on the particular study. So we're basically looking at the influence of droughts, the 2015 drought that we had, the one where even Cape Town ran out of water. So drought is something that is also becoming more and more common as we have climate change. So what we wanted to do with this particular study was to try and understand which factors affect the growth and survival of Karoo vegetation, and also looking at how this could also change in future. So like I've already explained, that temperature is expected to increase and the rainfall has also decreased, which means droughts are more likely to occur. So just to show you a picture over there. So this picture was taken in 2006 before the drought. As you can see, it's very nice and green, and everything seems to be happy and growing well. And then if you look at the same space during the drought, you see everything is brown. And this was taken at the same time of the year, by the way. So you can see that there is a difference in that. This is the kind of impact that drought has on the atmosphere. So this is an example of what a landscape would look like and what would happen during drought. And this is another reason why it was important to carry out this kind of study. So the aim of that study was just to look at the climate, the study, and understand how it has an impact on the vegetation in that particular area. And then also try to look at whether the 2015 drought was more severe compared to the other droughts that we've had. I'm not going to show the other temperature and rainfall graphs because they're similar to the ones which I had shown earlier. But then we also got to look at other indices which you can also use to indicate climate change. So in this particular graph here, we're looking at the hot indices. So basically the number of hot days with the maximum temperature is above 25 degrees, which is shown in red. The very hot days where the temperature is above 35 degrees, which is shown in the green. And then the warm nights, so where the minimum temperature is above 20 degrees. So as you can see, this also follows the same trend as the temperature graph that I showed earlier, where you find that the number of hot days or the hot indices are also increasing as the temperature increases. And also it's consistent with this particular one, which focuses on the cold indices. So looking at the number of cold days that you have in a particular year, as well as the number of days where you have frost. And that is also decreasing, which is consistent with the increase in temperature. But I would like to just pause a bit on this particular graph, which actually analyzes the length of the drought. So this particular graph here shows the SPEI, which is the Standardized Precipitation Evaporation Index. So this is an index that is used to measure drought. And this index integrates both the temperature and the rainfall and takes into account the soil moisture as well. So as you can see with this index, when it's blue, it means that there's no drought. And when it's red, it means that there is a drought. So what you can do with this particular one, you can look at the data by putting together a time period. So you can do it for 3 months, for 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, however long you want to analyze that data. And it does, I'm not going to go into the mechanics, but there's an equation that it uses to be able to calculate what the SPEI is. So as you can see from this particular graph, just get a pointer. You have a drought during the 1940s. So with this Karoo data set, it wasn't as long as the one which you had in the first study. It started from around 1940. That's why we don't have anything before that. So you can see there was a drought in the 1940s, but then every other drought following that was actually much shorter. But then if we focus in on this drought here, it seems to be much longer than the previous droughts, which could also be another effect of climate change. So this is just another way to show that climate change is happening and has been happening, and we need to take it more seriously. And then now I'm just going to move into some of the work that I'm doing for my PhD, which focuses mainly on seasonality. So seasonality is the predictable yearly cycle of an environmental variable. And seasonality has an effect on so many variables, such as ecosystem functions or community structure and composition, just to name a few of the variables that we have over there. And we get many different kinds of seasonality, but the main ones which people usually focus on are temperature seasonality and wet-dry seasonality or rainfall seasonality. So temperature seasonality is controlled by temperature, and this one is more important in the more temperate ecosystems where temperature controls the biological processes. And then the rainfall seasonality, which is the one which are more focused on, is the one that drives seasonality in Africa mostly, as it synchronizes growth and reproduction with the availability of water. So the distribution of plants and animals is controlled by the lack of water during certain times of the year. But before we get into the seasonality, I just want to show you this graphic over here, which just speaks about the changes that have been happening in the Earth. So climate change is something that has been happening for many, many, many years. And as you can see during those time periods, so from about 55 million years ago to 65 million years ago, that's what MYA stands for, million years ago. It just shows some of the changes that happened in the Earth during that time, which made it possible for wet dry seasonality to be established, as this is my particular objective. But then it just shows some of the changes that have been happening in the Earth during this time. So you can see that it became drier, it became warmer. So it is not something that is new, that it's getting drier and warmer. But now it's just that it is happening at such an accelerated pace, because if you look at this particular graphic, it took millions and millions of years to change what was happening on the Earth. But then if you look at the previous two studies that I've shown you, these changes are happening within 100 years or less, which is why we should really, really be concerned about the climate change that is happening. So seasonality is also a driver of community change. Seasonality is affected by climate change. If it gets warmer or if it gets drier, it means that it becomes more seasonal, and that also has an impact on the distribution of plants and animals and how populations can persist and coexist. So I'm just going to show you just a model of how seasonality influences plants and ecosystems. So if we look at this graph, get the point again. You can see that seasonality affects the kinds of trees that you find there, whether they drop the leaves, they're deciduous, or they keep the leaves. It affects the amount of fire that is there. So if it's drier, it's more likely to burn, and affects the amount of grass that we have over there. And at the same time, those factors also have an impact on each other. So that is why it is important to study seasonality as well as a driver of community change. So you can add more variables. This is just an example of one model that you can use, but you can add more variables to that. And seasonality also has an influence on the traits that plants and animals have, which is what we were trying to do in this particular study, which is to identify what traits plants and animals have in order to deal with seasonality. So we have these traits over there in this table. I'll just explain what is happening over there. So we group these traits into 3 different groups, which are avoidance, flexibility, and tolerance traits. So organisms deal with stress or climate change in different ways. So this is what we try to compile a list of how they deal with that. So the ones in orange are what animals use to deal with seasonal stress, and the ones in green are what plants use. I'm not going to go into too much detail on each and every one of those, but it just shows that if you need a lot of water to survive, then you're most likely to have avoidance traits. And if you need less water to survive, you're most likely to tolerate seasonality and climate change. So then this is just showing that this could change depending on what is happening in the particular atmosphere that you have. So you will find that some of these plants and animals, when they are in drier environments, they use a different kind of strategy to deal with seasonality. But when they're in wetter environments, they use a different kinds of strategy to deal with this seasonality. So I'm not going to go into all of these traits. And if you're really interested, we can speak after this. So another thing which is also important is how do we measure this wet, dry seasonality that I've been speaking about, this rainfall seasonality that I've been speaking about. So rainfall seasonality represents how rainfall is distributed within the year in a particular area. And this distribution has significant consequences on the magnitude of the intensity, and the length and the timing of the dry season, which are all important factors to consider. So I'll just share 3 ways in which you can measure rainfall seasonality. The first one is to measure the length of the dry season. So in this graph here, we're just showing how seasonal Africa is. So the ones which are the darker part of the graph shows like less seasonal parts, and then the lighter side part of the graph shows the more seasonal parts of Africa. So here we just calculated the number of months where the evaporation was higher than the rainfall in that particular place. And another thing to use in this is rainfall concentration, which calculates the distribution of rainfall throughout the year. So a value of 0% represents equal rainfall in all the months. And a value of 100% only shows that rainfall is only in 1 month of the year. So as you can see in this particular graph, the redder parts show more seasonal areas, and then the blue parts show less seasonal areas. And then another way which we can use to measure seasonality is using the number of growth days. So the number of growth days is how the plant's response to moisture, which is simplified at a daily level. So basically what we're doing here is to say whether there's enough water on a particular day for a plant to grow or not. So this takes into account the soil moisture as well as the kind of soil that you find in a particular place. So this is just an example of how we can measure seasonality. And then also there are other ways in which you can classify. So in this particular graph that I'm showing here, it's just looks at how herbivores are classified. So I spoke about the traits of plants and animals. And in this particular case, it's just an example of how we can classify animals according to their characteristics, and how those characteristics can be used to, and how they deal with seasonality, as well as how their distribution is affected. So this is just a graph where you can break down the different kinds of herbivores that we have. And this is important because we took that, from that graph, we took the mixed feeders, and we also tried to compare it to one of our seasonality maps to see which kinds of, or which group is affected by seasonality. As you can see, the mixed feeders are found in more seasonal places. So mixed feeders in this particular case, just to explain a bit, is that animals which can switch their diet during the dry seasons. So in the wet season, mixed feeders eat grass because that is what is available. But then when it becomes dry and grass is not available, they switch and they start eating trees. So they become browsers during that time. So as you can see that this trait of being a mixed feeder is also associated with seasonality. And the more seasonal it becomes, it means that being a mixed feeder is an advantage. And if we were to have more climate change, it means we could lose some of the other groups which are more specialized compared to these ones. And then the last section which I'd like to speak about is just mainly speaking about beta diversity, which is just changes in the community composition. I'm just going to explain it using these two graphs. So with community composition, you can explain it using nestedness and turnover. So nestedness means that you have a community. You have a community, so be it plants or animals, right? And then you also have a sub-community that is over there, which is a subset of the big community. So depending on the conditions that we find over there, you find that some species can survive in all kinds of conditions, but there's only a certain group that can survive in a specific community. I mean, that can survive in specific conditions. This is what nestedness is. And then over here, we have turnover, where if the conditions change, you lose one community and then you have another community. So there is a point where they overlap, but then when conditions change, you get two distinct communities. Unlike here, where you have one big community and then you have another one being a subset of the big community. So in this particular objective, we aim to identify which species are characteristic of seasonal environments and which species are associated with those sites, and then test whether those species are found in unique environments. To do that, we used a CSO network, which is a plot network that has about 9,000 plots of measurements that are collected in many countries in Southern Africa. If you want more information, you can just go to that particular website. So what we did with that, I don't want you to focus too much on the graph over there, but we found that there's high biodiversity in areas that have low seasonality. And then we found that there's low diversity in areas that have high seasonality. So if climate change was to happen, then we would lose a lot of biodiversity because it will become more seasonal as we go. So we can see that we have two separate communities, as I explained in the previous graph. So I'll just give a summary of this particular presentation and of some of the work which I've been doing. That seasonality is important in African ecosystems as it controls the distribution and ecology of plant and animal species. We've shown that the temperature has increased and the rainfall has decreased during the past 100 years. And the likelihood of drought has increased as well. And as droughts are also getting much longer. And then we're finding that also there is high beta diversity across gradients of seasonality in Southern Africa, which is influenced by turnover, as I shown in the previous graph, which means there are species that are specifically adapted to this particular environment. So if anything was to happen, like climate change, then would be very concerned for those species. Sorry, and I didn't touch on adaptation, but understanding ecosystem processes is the first step in being able to deal with climate change. And that way we'll be able to adapt to and mitigate climate change. Thank you very much. Wow.
We don't have time for questions as such, but I'm just going to read this one question. If you can maybe just answer that. By saying grasslands do not have biomass, are you referring to above ground biomass or plant biomass in general? Or they don't have more above ground biomass as tree does, hence they store their carbon below ground? And this comes from Tsumbetsu.
All right, so to answer that question is, and if you look at the above ground biomass, trees have more above ground biomass. Even grasses have more, grasses have less biomass, but it's not above ground. Most of it is below ground and they use their roots to be able to store the carbon. And also there are other plants that you find in grasslands, such as forbs, which also are important in the carbon cycle, but no one has really looked at their importance as much.